Okay, so again, as I've said before, this is really the overview of that, and I'm going to walk through each of these, and then when I get to the end, I'll try and lay out exactly what that means for each of the sectors that are participating in this. I can figure out how to make it move now. Okay. I think I've got it working now. Again, the first one was about rewarding collaboration, something that had come up. Again, this is an issue that had been raised previously in collaborative programs, because we were basing most of the information that we were working on IPEDS data. It really only the institution that actually conferred the degree got the credit for those graduates. And again, as we've tried to promote collaborative approaches to programs, it seemed like that was something that we needed to identify and to work through. So based on the work with the task force, our approach is going to be that all institutions that are in recognized cooperative programs will be able to report graduates for the related performance measures, typically as relates to just graduates. But so again, instead of just one school reporting it, each one will be able to. A part of that requires that the department establish criteria for when this approach is warranted. It may not always be the case. We need to be sure that we're identifying that, and so as you can see, what we were going to propose is that this would work in existing programs where there's a formal agreement in place between the institutions. And again, at this point, we're proposing the 25% is just a starting point, that at least 25% would be delivered by the institution that's reporting it. In a 50-50 program, both would. My hope is that as we identify new programs and approve new programs, that we can do that identification as a part of the new program approval process. But we'll probably have to go out with an information request for any existing cooperative programs. We know of some of them, but we certainly may not be aware of all of them. And so that's how we're wanting to approach rewarding collaboration. Second relates to a measure of efficiency. Again, efficiency has really been a central part of the process that the task force has undertaken. That and affordability have really been the issues that we've dealt with the most, and frankly the ones we've struggled with the most. This is kind of where we arrived at right now for COPHE institutions. As you can see, the operating salaries per FTE compared to median household income is what's on the table right now. There's not been a decision. That's something that I'm hoping we can come to a decision on next week. The reason why I noted change here, it's really the amount of change compared to those. That's what the comparison means. Does the operating salaries per FTE change more or less than the change in median household income? Core expenditures as a percent of total expenditures is an existing measure in the model, and so the task force felt like they wanted to retain that one. That was a good measure of institutional efficiency, really focusing on where is the money that we're spending going. For the community colleges, this particular one is very similar to the first COPHE measure. There are some differences to reflect the different missions of the community colleges, but again, it's just looking at instructional and support expenditures compared to non-instructional expenditures. Again, that's that same idea about are we spending our money on our core areas or in other areas. For state tech, we're still working with them on both of the issues of efficiency and affordability. Part of that is their desire to kind of wait and see how the other sectors had addressed this issue, and then they can figure out how to make similar measures work for their kind of unique situation. I can get my slide to change. There we go. Peer groups has been really an issue. It attracted a lot of attention when we had conversations with the legislature. We've had a tremendous amount of variability and change in that area, and so this was one of the real focuses, I would say, of the conversation. For the community colleges, they did not feel like it was as much of an issue for them, again, because it's a set group. The National Community College Benchmarking Project has been their comparison group, and they certainly want to try and retain that as their group that sets the benchmarks for them, and hopefully we've accommodated that. Even in some areas where we're looking at change, you'll see we've tried to maintain consistency with that benchmarking project. For the COPHE institutions and state tech, we're really moving away from and have dropped the institutionally selected peer groups and have moved toward using a systematic and uniform process for peer selection. Again, you can see in red these two items. This is the approach that we're working on right now. It would be selection criteria established by the MDHE in consultation with the sector and the institutions. Again, we want to try and provide a process that we can explain and say these are the parameters that we use. But in addition, we want to be sure that it's robust enough that it results in a sufficient number of institutional peer group that has enough institutions in it that it really is a valid comparison. And so sometimes that takes some minor adjustments based on the institution that is involved in the sector. So the second part of that would be that each year the MDHE would come back to that and look, because obviously it's a dynamic process that we're looking at, and be sure that there continue to be sufficient peers for all institutions. So we had kind of looked at about 10 institutions being the minimum amount that we think should be there. So we may have instances where institutions, peer groups who are kind of close to that line, if they drop below that, we would work with them to adjust the criteria so that we could, again, move that number back up so that we have a sufficient number involved to be sure that we have a valid group for comparison purposes. The question has also come up about the existing graduate outcomes measure. Again, this was introduced as a part of the legislative process when the performance funding model was codified in statute. One of the things that was added was what we tentatively called the sixth measure that would look at what happens to graduates after they leave the institution. I think in general everyone feels like we've done a lot of work in this area, and where we've arrived is a reasonable and legitimate place to be for COPHE institutions. They're administering the first destination survey that was put together by, I think it's the National Association of Colleges and Employers. It's really pretty much the state of the art in terms of collecting that information, and it does provide kind of a national context as well. And that survey would look at graduates within 6 months after graduation. For the community colleges, it's kind of a two-part process. One would look at 180-day follow-up for their career and technical education programs, basically following the Perkins model. But then for students that were not a part of that, if that's transfer graduates or those kinds of things, we would look at the wage and salary data to try and find them as well, and then also look at the National Clearinghouse to determine whether those students were continuing their education. As we've looked at this, that really captures somewhere around 85 or 90% of the graduates, and while that's not the entire picture, that's probably as good as we're going to be able to get in this kind of a setting. And then state tech, basically because they are very much focused on this career and technical programs, they've always had this percent of employment at 180 days. They will continue to use that measure as we go forward. The two open items here are obviously this one hasn't been used in the past, and so we do have the issue of when will we implement this, and I think that's still open for discussion. We'll have the second group of data later this year, and so potentially we would have enough data to be able to at least begin to implement this for the FY19 budget process. And so sometime in late December or early January, we'll have that information. Again, this is still an issue of conversation with the task force, with you folks as well, and honestly with the governor's office and the legislature. They've been pushing to get this implemented. It's been in place for several years now, and they feel like we should be incorporating it. In addition to that, once we get that additional data, we really have to deal with how are we going to go about measuring this, what kinds of success criteria. So, for example, should we set a floor response rate on the first destination survey, that an institution response rate has to be 50%, for example. And I'm just throwing that number out for conversation's sake. That the response rate has to be 50% in order to participate in this measure. It seems like there should be some floor level of participation. And then how are we going to measure success? What's going to constitute sustained excellence? How do you determine, other than perhaps year-over-year improvement or a 3-year rolling average improvement, how do we measure and determine when acceptable performance has been achieved? So those are still the items that we're working on that item. Again, I feel like from a measure perspective, we're in pretty good shape. We just have to figure out how to incorporate it into the model. The menu of measures was also another issue where we've had a substantial amount of questions. Again, as you'll recall, particularly for the COPHE institutions, there have been a set of measures that institutions could choose from depending on their specific mission and clientele. I don't believe, not necessarily correctly so, but that certainly has raised concern about being able to game the system. So I only pick the ones that I'm good at, and it may not be an effective measure. Again, I don't think that's what's going on, but it certainly created that perception. And so we've moved away from the majority of menu items. For the COPHE institutions, the only one that will remain will be this one about student performance on these assessments, whether it's general education, major field, or professional or occupational licensure. And this is an existing measure. What will be different is that once the assignment is made, the institution will really be dedicated to that particular one. It's not one that's subject to change at various times. And that's not to say that once you choose it, you'll be locked in for the next 20 years, but I think we want to move away from at least the perception that I can move among these whenever I want to when it's in my best interest. In terms of community colleges and state tech, there will be no menus left in those. They're going to, the community colleges had implemented a couple of years ago a set of menu items related, as we were moving away from the developmental ed measures. The task force members have decided, basically we'll pick one of those and the menu items will disappear. The first time data really came up as part of our conversation with a couple of legislative committees that had asked us to make presentations about this, and the issue was for many institutions, maybe for the majority, first-time, full-time degree-seeking students is no longer the majority of the folks that you're dealing with. And for some institutions, it's a relatively small proportion of their overall enrollment. And so we wanted to raise a question about, is it time to move away from that? Do these measures need to reflect that broader population as opposed to that fairly narrow group? It was designed because it's relatively easy to measure, and we have national data on that. So the approach that's been taken from the COPHE institutions is the success and efficiency measures are moved towards an FTE basis as opposed to first-time, full-time. So it's now completions per FTE as opposed to a graduation rate, which was tied to that first-time, full-time amount. For community colleges, again, this is where the relationship with the Community College Benchmarking Project came into play. There really isn't a comparable measure right now the community colleges in that benchmarking project. And so what's under discussion right now is that as an interim measure, they'll continue to retain the completion rate, and that also includes transfer students for first-time, full-time students. But they will explore the possibility of a broader measure, again, going back probably to the FTE as the basis, with the benchmarking project, and hopefully they can be successful in getting them to incorporate that into that process, and then they'll be able to move to that and maintain the consistency with that comparison group. State Tech has made the decision they want to retain the completion rate of first-time, full-time students there. Again, I think the part-time and other issues that some deal with are not as big of an issue for them, and so this may be the best measure from that perspective for them. Weighting was another issue that we spent some time on, and again, I think this was really generated from the department's perspective. We've always had weighting, or I should maybe not always, but for the last set of the model, we've had the STEM and healthcare weighting at 50%, and the decision was made that we need to continue to focus on those areas. Again, this is to try and provide incentives for institutions to enroll, retain, and graduate individuals in these particular program areas, and I think those needs still exist, and so the decision has been to continue to have those. I think a big part of the conversation was how do we provide similar kinds of incentives for enrolling underserved populations. We all know if we're going to achieve what we need to in terms of attainment or other goals that we've set, that we need to do a better job of serving those students, and we need to be able to reflect that as a part of performance funding, and performance funding should reward the institutions that are doing a good job at that. And so the decision was made. We looked at a number of different ways we might do that. The decision has really been made to focus on Pell-eligible students as a proxy for those underserved populations. Weighting has been, we talked about that. Again, you can see that's in red. I've thrown out 50% weighting. That'll be a topic of conversation. I have talked to some folks that are kind of experts in this field on a national perspective, and their advice was that over time, seeing those kinds of weightings move up is what's going on nationally. So, for example, the example they gave was in earlier versions, Tennessee has been kind of on the front end of this, weighted underserved populations to 40%. They've now moved to weighting that at an 80%. And so, again, there's been more and more attention on this, and so we'll have to kind of look at the data and see what the weighting is. But I kind of put 50% out there as a starting point for that conversation. Sustained excellence, as most of you probably know, one of the components of our model is to set a sustained excellence threshold so that once an institution reaches a certain level of performance, it's probably not appropriate to expect year-over-year comparison or improvement in that area. That as long as you can continue to perform at that higher level, that should be sufficient for success in this area. We did have a very long conversation about whether that the current approach, which is if you're in the top 1/3 of peer comparisons, that would be sustained excellence. But based on that conversation, the decision was made to retain our current approach to that. So there are not as many that are going to be peer-based in this new model as there were in the past, but they will continue to use the top 1/3. Except for the assessment measure one that I referenced before. That one has always been based on the admission category, and so we're going to continue in that area. So rather than it being based on that moving target, it's set specifically based on the admission category of the institution. The issue of performance floor also came up. Again, the idea here is should there be a minimum level of performance in order for an institution to participate? Should a persistence rate or a graduation rate, should there be a point below which if you're below that threshold, you can't participate. You have to be performing at least at a certain level in order to be a part of it. I think the idea was, however, in this conversation, that really this is about improving outcomes, and so that should be our focus. Are we moving in the right direction? Are we increasing our outcomes, regardless of what the starting point is? So it doesn't matter where I am, as long as I'm making progress toward that goal and I'm improving performance in those areas, that I ought to be recognized for that and receive that. So again, all institutions should be eligible to participate regardless of where they are. It shouldn't be compared to other institutions or some arbitrary threshold we set. Again, as I indicated earlier when I talked about graduate outcomes, I think that's still an open question for that, particularly related to the response rate. So I think that will continue to be a piece of conversation because it is survey-based. Should we expect there a certain level of response in order to participate in that particular measure? But again, I think that's still an open question at this point. Data verification, this really came from the state audit that came out last year about this time, I think, or maybe it was later, maybe it was earlier this year. Time flies when you're having fun, I suppose. And really did question our ability to verify the data that was being provided to us. And unfortunately, when the auditor went to some institutions to verify the numbers that they had provided us, they were unable to do that. And so I think it's appropriate for us to come back and say, we're going to have to do something more in this area to be able to verify for people that, yes, the numbers we're getting are real, yes, we're sure that they're accurate, and we've done due diligence to determine that. And so in a general sense, we're going to conduct some periodic data checks to ensure that data is verifiable and that it supports the performance reported by the institution. One part of that is going to be a data retention policy for performance funding. I've thrown out 3 years. I don't know if that's the appropriate threshold. It maybe needs to be longer than that. Maybe it needs to be shorter. But we'll need something so that institutions understand we need to keep the data that's supporting that information for a certain period of time. And then I think as our staff is able, I think we're going to probably move toward conducting some periodic desk audits, asking you to submit some information to us so that we can review and do that kind of verification. We've begun a process like this for similar reasons in our student financial aid programs, and it probably makes sense to put some kind of a process in place here that is similar. Then what we've got left are other issues. Although affordability wasn't on the list initially from the commissioner, it did emerge as an issue that we needed to address, both from the legislature and the governor's office. This has been, I would argue, one of the most difficult issues that we've had to deal with, and as you can see, there's still a lot of movement going on here. We haven't really nailed this one to the floor as much as we have in a number of other areas. But this is what I understand that we're looking at right now, and hopefully we can bring to conclusion at the meeting next week. For the COPHE institutions, it would look at net tuition and fee revenue from Missouri undergraduates. So we're looking at what money from Missouri undergraduates compared to Missouri undergraduate FTE, and then compare that to the statewide median household income. And again, this is one where it's change compared to change, instead of trying to look at a ratio or those kinds of things. So is one moving more than the other? We do, as you can see, we've got further discussion required in terms of what's included in the tuition and fee revenue, what's excluded, how do we go about that. I know Jeremy Kinsel has asked for some additional information from the institution. We're going to be sending out some additional information about this one to help inform that conversation. For community colleges, again, we're in a very similar area, net tuition and fees from Missouri residents compared to Missouri FTE compared to median household income. The change here really is about we're looking at the service area of the community college rather than statewide. That seemed appropriate given the way the state is divided up, and so It won't be a perfect fit. The median household income, it's my understanding, is provided by county, and so there may be some minor variations at the borderlines where some pieces don't fit exactly right, but hopefully that's a fairly small issue, and we'll be able to nail this one to the floor based on this approach. State Tech, again, as I indicated earlier, this one's under discussion. I think we're set to have a conversation with them once we're pretty sure where these are going to be. Again, the idea here being that to the extent that we can, try and make these measures as similar as we can. And again, I think that helps us when we start to explain this to legislators and others, and it leads to a level of consistency that works well, but we have to be careful that we don't undermine the differences among our institutions and different populations that they serve as we go about that process. So again, these are still issues that are up for discussion. Other things that we've looked at, but at this point aren't included. We did talk about inclusion of a portion of the core. Again, the national experts that I've worked with and did make a presentation at one of our earlier meetings has said that they are now calling that a best practice in this. They indicated that offering a portion of that can buy a lot of goodwill in the legislature. We had a lot of conversations about that. But again, the decision was made that right now, again, partially because of the way the statute is constructed, that we would not incorporate that into the process right now, at least formally. And in terms of weighting, I just wanted to show we have talked about a number of other groups that we might look at. Again, rather than focus just on STEM, does it make sense to look at where high demand employment is going on in the state? It may not all be in the STEM or healthcare fields, although those do cover a good portion of it. Do we need to look at that in a different way? Teacher education, should it be included? That's an area we need to discuss further as well. We had pulled some of that out based on the changes that were being made at the time a couple of years ago when we were looking at this. Is it time to reincorporate that into that process? And then I think, again, to go back to our attainment goal and the things that we're going to have to do if we're going to make sufficient progress there, I think serving adult populations, in this case 25 and above, are a critical part of that. But again, the decision was made not to go with that, at least for the time being. So here I want to switch and kind of, as a summary, look at what we're doing for each sector. Again, I haven't highlighted here the ones that are up for change, but I do want to focus on, at this point, given what we've talked about, here are the 6 measures that we would be looking at. Again, knowing that some of these might change in some sense as we reach some final decisions. So completions per FTE, this one would be weighted based on those items I talked about before, Pell Grants, STEM, and healthcare, and percent of students meeting or exceeding assessment performance thresholds. Again, that's along with the 3 items, whether it's a measure of general education, a measure of major knowledge or licensure, professional licensure or occupational licensure pass rates. So those ones, and again, that's an existing measure. Operating salaries per FTE, core expenditures as percent of total expenditures, that's an existing measure, and then the tuition and fee piece, and then finally the graduate outcomes using the first destination survey. For the community colleges, at least this is where I think we are. We retain the 3-year completion rate that includes transfers. Again, as I think we're still open for discussion, that may be an interim approach as they look at the possibility of moving the benchmarking project toward an FTE-based measure. Percent of attempted credit hours successfully completed. That's an existing measure that's within one of those menus. They decided that was a good one to retain. And then the percent of CTE graduates passing licensure and certification exam. Again, another one that's being retained from the previous model. Under efficiency and affordability, those core expenditures compared to non-core, and then affordability in the net tuition and fees compared to median household income and graduate outcomes, as I've described earlier. SAPEC, again, 3-year completion rate, they're going to stay with that. They are going to incorporate the completions per FTE, and then percent of students successful in major field assessment. Efficiency and affordability is still under discussion, and I mentioned the graduate outcomes. So that kind of covers what I've got. I thought I'll take just a minute to talk about the next steps. Again, we do have a meeting of the task force next week, which I said it was final. I'm hopeful it's final. We need to finalize the remaining measures, look at an information timeline, and then I'm going to send out to the task force between now and that meeting a report that incorporates all of the draft recommendations, moving toward the coordinating approval, which will happen later in the fall. I don't know, that could happen at the December coordinating board meeting. We are looking at perhaps, not just based on this, but on some other issues that are on the table. We may have a conference call meeting before that December meeting, and so depending on where we are, we may be able to finalize this process at that earlier date. A date hasn't been set yet for that, but that is a possibility. At that point, then, we would transmit that information to the governor and the legislature to inform the upcoming FY19 budget process. I also wanted to mention some dates that are further out, just that we need to keep in mind. The statute that was passed that codified this requires that by the end of October in 2019 that the department conduct an effectiveness review of our performance funding model. We've begun to talk about that. It's going to be a challenge because it's really been a moving target over the last 5 or 6 years since this began. Everything began back in 2012. And so it's going to be a challenge to be able to do that, but we are on the hook to do that, and so we'll move forward with that. At this point, what we've always done in the past is said every 3 years we're going to come back together to look at the model. Is it working? Are there adjustments that we need to be made? Assuming we stay on that same schedule, then the next review like that would occur in 2020. I would assume, much as it has been in the past, that we would do that over the summer of 2020. So that's all I have. Again, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. Do we have any that are coming over the chat line? Well, I need to. So with that, I'm going to quit sharing my screen and open up my chat box so I can. Okay. Well, one question was about what are operating salaries, whose salaries are included. That's been an ongoing conversation. I don't know that we've nailed that to the floor at this point. That will likely come out of budget materials. Again, right now, we ask institutions as a part of the budget process for that kind of information, and so that's where I see that data coming from. But what we include and what we don't include, I think, is still open for discussion. That's one of the things that we'll have to nail down as we go forward with this. That's one of the things that's really difficult. We want to be sure that it's the right group of salaries. We don't want to provide the wrong kind of incentive or have an unintended consequence in that regard. So that's still an open item for conversation. There's also a question about the salaries per FTE. The FTE is students in that regard. So again, that's what we would compare that to, I believe, if I'm reading that correctly.
Yeah, I would second everything Leroy said. This is Jeremy about, we can still have some conversations about what is and isn't included, how we might want to tweak it. Right now, we are just grabbing the operating salaries and the E&G out of the budget and revenue forms that you're reporting DHE as is. So I just took those. Originally, I included benefits as well. I have another version that I'll send out that is just salaries. Because I got a couple of comments and some feedback about that too. So I'll follow up with that along with a couple of other pieces we're working on. But as it is now, it's just the data that you all are reporting to us, not iPads, but that you're reporting to DHE.
Good. And I also have another question about instructional academic support expenditures in non-instructional areas. It's a similar conversation there. We've had general conversation about that, but we need to nail that to the floor. That's again going to be a topic coming up. But again, the idea is to try and focus on what has a direct impact on students. Are we spending money on things that have a direct impact on students, that help support them, whether it's in the classroom or otherwise, as opposed to other kinds of expenditures that we might have? And again, we've had a number of conversations about that. I understand kind of the challenges of that, and we don't, as I said before, we don't want to create a situation where we're providing a disincentive for good things, or where we're having some unintended consequences. But we've really got to be able to find a way to nail this to the floor so we can tell the story and that we have some skin in the game, if you will, about how we are being efficient, how we're doing the best we can in that area, because there's still continue to be questions about that. I think it's the last question that at least I see is about, can we send out the median household income numbers that will be used? I haven't talked to Jeremy about that, but I feel confident we can. We're still working on trying to pull all of that together. But yeah, I think certainly by the meeting on the 11th, we should be able to have that information available. Did you have something else, Jeremy?
Yeah, if that question is from one of the community colleges, and it's about the median household income we calculated by service region. We did send that out to the task force, but we didn't necessarily send it out more broadly. We can certainly share that. We also, one limitation of the data that we have is that we're only able to calculate that by county. So we have to kind of equate your service regions to counties, which aren't an exact match, and we did ask, again, just the people in the task force so far to kind of give us some feedback on which counties that we'd use to calculate the value for each of the community colleges, but we can give some other folks some input on that as well.
Well, that's all the questions I see right now. Again, if there are others, feel free to go ahead. I'll wait just a couple of minutes. Well, the question now, again, was basically on the household income is from the four-year institutions. Jeremy, can we share that information?
We can too. If you saw, again, there's some things that we've shared with the task force that we haven't shared more broadly, but what we did on operating salaries per FTE also included for reference the statewide figures for median household income. So we have that, we can share it.
Okay, good. I did get a question about sharing a copy of the PowerPoint. I'd be happy to do that. I'll either send it out to the group, or probably what I'll do instead is, it may be easier, we do have a web page about performance funding. I'll take the blame. I haven't been able to keep it up quite the way I had hoped I would be able to, but I'll post this there as well. And I'll try and post the recording of this webinar there as well. So not only can you get the PowerPoint, but if you're interested, if you're bored some afternoon and need something to put you to sleep, then you can play that. We did have a question, will we have a way to do similar reporting of student graduation rates to federal DOE that's being proposed among MDHE institutions? I'm assuming you're talking about we're kind of moving away from that first-time, full-time, and more toward right now we're talking about an FTE base. It's my understanding that the Department of Ed is starting down that road. They're not there yet. Right now it's still kind of the same thing we've always had. But it's my understanding they're beginning to look at, and may even be doing some piloting of looking at not only first-time, full-time, but incorporating part-time students and a broader student conversation. So the short answer is, for right now, I don't think the two are together. As we move down the road, and as DOE becomes, their process becomes more robust, and they provide that kind of opportunity, we'll certainly want to be able to match those back together. And so maybe in the coming years, once they get that in place, we'll want to come back and say, okay, well, we were doing it this way. This is more consistent with the federal methodology. what do we think about that? So I want to make that commitment that we want to try and be as consistent with other data that you're reporting as we can. It's just becoming a struggle as we've tried to move this process forward.
We will look at it, and we can keep an eye on it. There's a new, actually, component of the IPED survey called outcome measures, and it looks at some information on graduation rates, transfer out for full and part-time students, for students who were first-time and non-first time when they came to your institution. The trouble is that component's only 2 years old, and the second year of the collection was substantially different from the first year. So I would echo everything Leroy said, but the fact that we just need to let that mature and give a chance to actually get some consistent trend data, but it's certainly something that we're hopeful about and want to keep an eye on.
Okay, and I did have one more question about the PowerPoint being available. We will make that available in all likelihood. It will be on our website on the performance funding page. So it may take me a couple of days, so maybe first of next week check on that, and we should have it then.
And I will coordinate with Leroy to send out a few of the other materials, the household income, maybe some more background on core expenditures. Perhaps we can send those all out in one package. Okay.
I just one more question about the median household income. The question is, and it's from a community college, is will it be weighted based on the population in each county, or will we simply do an average of the counties? I think...
No, we did exactly that. We looked at the 25 to 64 population in each county, the working age population, and we used that to weight the income.
Okay, so...
By we, I mean Jude. I think you did a great job on that.
Well, again, so the answer is we will definitely be doing that way, or that's the approach that we're taking right now, is that it will be a weighted based on each county within that, rather than just a gross average across all of them. Any other questions? We're running close. We're still within our time frame, but if there are any other questions, now's your chance. Well, seeing none, again, I'm going to wrap things up. Again, I want to express my appreciation to everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll get something of value as a part of this. And again, we'll try and keep you in the loop as we go forward. We want to be sure everyone is aware of what's going on, and look forward to continuing to work both with the task force and with everyone else as we go forward with this. So thanks again, and have a great day.